Welcome to the new tutorial. This time we are going to talk about the second stage of this painting. As you've seen in the previous video, in the Alla Prima demo, I finished rather with a flat surface and without a lot of details. So everything at this moment looks more or less correct, but still, in my opinion, looks too generic. And sometimes when I work using such photos as in this case, I focus mostly on the shapes, on the big shapes and on the form, and I don't rush with the colors because we don't really see a lot of color information on this photo. I say many times to paint from life, at least for me, is easier than to paint from photos like that. And in the case of painting from photo, I know that the process will be slower than if I was painting from life. Another thing to consider is when painting from photos like that I try to keep my first layer very thin. You can see it now in the shadows. It's just a first layer, very diluted, almost transparent. So, and maybe just in some light areas I have thicker layer of paint, but almost everywhere it's just as thin as possible. In this case, it is way more easier to paint on top of that. For oiling out, I was using epoxide oil gel from Rublev. I never used it before for oiling out, mostly for small impasto work or just for any kind of effect in the dark. But this time I've decided just to oil out everything and also to use the epoxide oil gel as my painting medium in this second layer. So far what I can tell about it is that the colors, especially in the shadows, they look slightly more vibrant and clean when I use epoxide oil gel. It is why I want to experiment with it even more to find out its properties and to decide whether it is good for me or not. What you can see now on the screen is that I am refining the smaller planes. So I constantly focus on subtle planes, small shapes, and the changes of these planes, like here in the muzzle of the mouth. It is not equally light. There are at least 3 values in gradation from the lower part of the muzzle of the mouth up to the most lightest parts. And the same you can see I did with upper eyelids, for example. So I deliberately keep the values flat and I don't use the lightest light in the first layer. Sometimes we can use lightest light and build on top of that, but in this case, since I don't see a lot of colors, I've decided that I would rather have halftones and the shadows and build more lights with the textures later. So normally I'm looking at this stage, I look for small planes which are most perpendicular to the light source, hence they are lighter than the others. And by finding them and making them lighter, I try to increase the illusion of three-dimensionality of the head. The palette at this moment looks almost empty, so all my mixtures are very thin, like just a tiny bits of pigments, because I'm preparing the shapes, the form for the final layer of textures. So there is no point to mix a lot of pigment now, especially when we have such delicate value information in the shadows. Because for me, I would like to have the secondary light source as well on the side of her cheekbone. So it will be interesting challenge to paint it with a effortless look, but with a certain precision in the value structure. If you look into the eyes now, you will see that they are almost blurry. There is no precise drawing of the irises of the eyes, for example, because for me, I try to follow the value information which I see when I squint, and when I squint at this reference, everything below the upper eyelids are rather just shadow shapes. I use Eclipse brushes from Rosemary to soften painting areas, and also to apply hatching looking brushwork. Sometimes these strokes, they look like multiple hatches. So eventually I try to balance between softness of the skin, precision of the drawing of the features, and painterly effect of direct painting with all the textures, brushworks, and different colors. Now I try to introduce more chroma into the lights. I see some reds and pinks in the nose area, around her lips, and in the cheekbone. At least some orange in the light of the cheekbones. So I'm trying to create additional variety into the colors of the halftones. For me, it was always a challenge to avoid monochromatic look of my paintings, because the skin is very subtle and colors are rather dull, less saturated. So we tend to, at least myself, I found myself ignoring small changes in the color of the skin, and I ended up with very flat and very boring skin tone representation. It is why I prefer to paint with more saturation at this stage, for example, and just alter it later, reduce the contrast of the colors to find some cohesion. But different decisions, different temperature and color brush strokes, they will create variety in the final painting. So still refinement of everything below the nose. And another thing is, when I feel like I'm tired working in one area, when I'm starting to make some mistakes, I switch to another area of the painting. So painting like that, direct painting, is constant balance, and you have to be aware about what is going on. And if you are not making painting better, and you see it, it is better to have a break or just to switch your focus to other area. The palette, by the way, is slowly expanding, but still very small amount of pigments, and just a few pigments I'm using at this moment to build small forms on top of the big form structure. What is really helping to have the mouth painted correctly is to keep the edges soft. Like in the corner of her mouth, you can see that the edges are not soft, they're almost lost. And it helps a lot. Because if you draw the mouth with equally sharp edges everywhere, it will look artificial. It will seldom look like proper representation. Now you can see that I build more darks, and it is one of the greatest ways of painting, in my opinion, is when we start with the shadows, with the just approximal shadows first, and we introduce the darkest darks and just darker accents or occlusions inside of the shadow to create additional to bring more information and to create an illusion of reflected light in the shadow shapes. So me personally, I don't really like when I have to make shadow lighter. I try to avoid it. I prefer to make shadow darker in certain areas. It is why sometimes it's just easy to start with the lights which are slightly darker and with the shadows which are slightly lighter. But the most important is to constantly keep the difference between the light and dark groups of values. So brushes are getting smaller and softer. And you see, with the edge, sometimes you can just blend it with a brush like this. You need fluidity. In this case, you can use medium to increase the flow of paint, or you can use thicker mixture of the paint, like loading the brush with a pigment. It will also give you opportunities to blend it and just to use your soft sable brush for gradations and delicate changes of the values in such subtle planes as in her muzzle of the mouth area. And now you will see an example of situation when I need to make shadow lighter. But I'm just erasing this shadow, part of the shadow, making it the light family of values again, because I've decided to introduce the secondary light source. So technically, this orange area which I am painting is not the shadow anymore. For the light there, I'm using Sinus Orange, the pigment which quite similar to cadmium orange in color and almost matches cadmium with the tinting strength, but it is not opaque. It is semi-opaque or semi-transparent, so works very well for such painting on top of the shadow, like in this case. Here I've noticed now that the connection of the ear and the face should be moved more to the right, so I am carefully repainting the ear. And since I've changed the tilt of the head in the initial stage, I tried to analyze my construction instead of just copying the photo reference. So normally, for me, the building of the portrait is the recreation rather than just copy. It is why I recommend to all the time. I recommend to do a lot of constructive sketches, learn anatomy, and also try to see the head as a complex of the shapes under the light. It helps to simplify the visual information we deal with. Like the hair, for example. Here, at this stage, the hair just represents the general changes of the big planes. The shadow, the light, a couple of highlights, and it's all. My idea and my philosophy is to try to achieve representation with abstract methods. So I really like to have at least part of the painting painted really loose, but it should look believable from the distance. So it is why I constantly step away from my painting during this stage. And also, if I am not able to step away or just to walk away and come back, sometimes I half squint at my painting. So it helps also to see how the shapes are working together. So I would say that I constantly keep my focus on the planes and how different planes are and how to show this difference with values and the changes of the color. And at the same time, I try to look at my painting as a whole to see how does it look from the distance or when I squint looking at it. So I would say the optical effect is very important for me. More changes, more halftones. And for the transitional halftone, I try to find as many colors as possible. It is why more greens now. I use viridian and I use phthalo green. And I also use transparent red oxide now for for transitional halftones or just for the darker halftones. Because the light is replacing, it is changing the local color. So stronger the light, less local color we see, more of the color of the light source instead. And in the shadows, the color of the shadow is determined by the color of bouncing light, of reflected light from the environment. It is why indoor light, single light source situation, the shadows very often they look warmer. But the transitional halftones, they can be absolutely different because they are true to local color. Since the light is not so powerful to replace the local color and the shadow, and it is not in the shadow anymore, so the darker halftones and transitional halftones, they can provide a lot of variety in the temperature and in the local color. So we can see a lot of greens, purples, pinks, yellows, even in the pale skin tones like we see, like we have in this case. The video is sped up 2 times, so consider it when you look at my actions. And you see a lot of small brush work. So now technically I am hatching with a fully loaded soft brush. It is synthetic sable. They're not as good as real sable ones, but for many reasons I would like to change all my sables, to stop using them. So I'm testing different substitutions for the sable brushes. There is a red series from Rosemary, and this one is from Skoda. The lightest halftones, they are cooler than the rest of the halftones. It is why I use more of the King's Blue now for the lights. I even tried to force this bluish tint of the lights to make it stronger than I see. And here's some green. So technically, there is no huge difference between the different types of the temperature. So if you feel like the lights are going to be cooler, the green can work, the blue can work, the purple can work, or even pink. Because it should be just cooler. The final mixture should be just cooler in comparison with the darker ones. Now it's time to introduce the lightest planes of the forehead, and these planes are making forehead way more three-dimensional than before. And as you can see in the lights now, I use very crude looking brush work, indicating the most lightest planes in the area with the different colors and different levels of saturation. And now I'm just blending it with a soft brush, By the way, it is long comber brush Eclipse from Eclipse series of rosemary brushes. I like these brushes because I can blend with a dry brush, just empty brush, very soft, and I can control the gradations and the values. And also I can just half load it with a pigment and apply it semi-transparently on top of the established layers. So you can see I can create gradation, but with different colors, way easier and faster than with the other types of brushes. Now, cleaner version of the orange. So it is again this sinus orange pigment with medium. And for the darkest darks, I use the same orange now because I want to key this color in the painting. I don't want this orange to be just in one area of the face and nowhere else. So I use this pigment for the darkest dark of the background. And on the reference, we can see that the background is rather very warm. So it makes sense to work this way. I recommend to use the pigments which you use for costume or for the background, to use certain amount of this pigment for the skin tone mixtures, especially for the lights, or sometimes as rim light or reflected light in the shadow. Such approach is increasing cohesion of the picture in general and creates interesting color design, which is very pleasing to look at. So continuation of the scumbling, of blending, strong brush strokes on top of the blended areas, and blending on top of such brush strokes to apply another one and another one, constantly changing the color and temperature. So I'm not trying to achieve exact or correct value from in the very beginning. I want to achieve the illusion of it, illusion of representation of the form, but while using different colors and temperatures and different thickness of the paint, and even different brush strokes with different brushes. Soon enough, you will see how I use different tools for creating unique marks on the painting. So the brushes which I was using, I can describe them as three types. First is long flats, soft flats, Eclipse series. Long kind of a bristle type of flats, also synthetic ivory series, like this one. And round sable and sable substitutes, mostly for the skin tones and for the precise drawing and depicting the form. From all these three different types, I think round sables or just round soft brushes, they are most important, at least for female portrait. But the hair looks a little bit chaotic and quite peculiar on the reference, so I feel like I need some different approach to mark making in the hair. It is why now I try to establish the structure of the face, bring it to the almost finished stage, and to switch into the hair and the background. Now I'm revisiting the silhouette of the head of the face, and even now I try to depict the form with corners and with straight lines instead of curves, because each corner shows the changes of the planes, and I try to make symmetrical representation of these planes. On one side I'm using changes of the values, and on the other side I'm using, because we don't have really strong changes of the values, on the other side I'm using the silhouette, the contour, just the drawing of these shapes. Now it's time to paint the eyes. So the same as before, I just go darker on top of the darks. It also can help to control the edges. In my opinion, it is safer to assume that the most of the edges in the human's body are soft, and use sharp edge very sparingly. In the head, the sharpest edge is the highlight in the eye. So the rest of the edges I try to maintain softer. More softening of the forehead, drawing of the highlights. The photo shows the big highlight in the center of the forehead. Me personally, I prefer to find the area where different planes are meeting under the light. So the edge of these planes, the actual meeting of these planes, is going to be the highlight, and not just big one area. So I would suggest that the frontal planes of the forehead, they are not highlights, they are lighter halftones, and the actual highlight should be smaller and more precise, showing the meeting of the different planes. I use moments like this when I just jump around with a clean, soft brush, blending things. I use these moments to relax, to have a break from precision making or from rendering, and to evaluate my painting and the reference. So it is very tactical approach, especially when we paint from life. To have such breaks, but without actually. More refinement of the shapes, especially in the nose. And I really like to work this way when I already have the structure of the head dry. So even if I totally screw up the second layer, I can just take the mineral spirits and wash everything off, keeping the first initial layer on the canvas. There are many ways of bringing back the previous layer or blending these two layers with a sanding or with using palette knife, sometimes even scraping down the second layer, keeping part of it, like scumbling in some residues of paint. So the first layer and the second layer will be blended together. But in this case, I just want to, I just refine things and I build things on top. So I'm not altering or changing or fixing anything. Now, as usual, I try to achieve the sharpest edge of the highlights in the irises of the eyes with just tip of painting knife. And with the smallest sable round brush, I just refine the shapes, refine the shapes of the eye sockets. And again, the sable round, you can use it for precise drawing, for applying some, for filling some small shapes, but also for blending, because the tip is very thin and soft. So sable rounds, they provide a lot of control. It is why I like them so much. After some time working on the top of the head, I went down to the chin again to see that the highlight in the chin was too bright. Now, since I have the highlight on the forehead, I can compare the rest of the highlights. And my goal is to keep the highlight on the forehead the lightest light. So the rest of the highlights are going to be subordinated and darker, gradually darker than the highlight on the forehead, because the forehead is the nearest area to the light source, and the frontal planes of the forehead are most perpendicular to the light source. Hence, this highlight is going to be the brightest bright. It is why I am blending the highlight on the upper eyelid as well. Just decided to revisit, to rebuild this structure. So constant comparison, especially of the values, is the key to create successful representation. Now I use another soft long flat. This time is Master Choice series. I think it is Badger type synthetic badger hair. Or, yeah, because Eclipse is synthetic mongoose and this one is badger. Revisiting of the highlight there as well because it was too thin and too sharp. So I prefer to achieve the thickness of the lights building layer on top of the layer instead of just mixing a lot of paint in the beginning and just applying thick mixture. On the palette you can see that the most variety of the colors is situated in the halftones area, and it makes a lot of sense since, as we discussed, the shadows are more unified and the lights they tend to be just cooler version of the halftones. So technically in the lightest light areas I try to bring chroma inside of the highlights, which can be also very interesting just to bring 2 or 3 complementaries. It can be pink, and inside of the pink it can be slightly lighter green, or it can be blue, and inside of this blue area it can be slightly lighter yellow, and it will look more vibrant than just one temperature highlight. Continue to soften the edges in around the mouth, and if you rewind or open the previous the end of the alla prima stage, you will see how sharp edges in the lips were, but now they are way softer and more accurate in my opinion. So now almost everything in the face is finished, and I can focus on the hair. And for the hair, I see that I need a lot of pale green mixture, so I'm using Viridian. And I try to find abstract shapes which can represent both the form of the whole structure and also the texture of the hair which we see on the reference. So now I apply quite thick load of pigment with a palette knife. The palette knife is a really nice tool because you can create nice shapes with a sharp edge, but the knife itself is flexible, so you can also blend with it. Sometimes all you need is just to add a little bit of gel medium, and you can create really perfect gradations using flexible palette knife. There are different types. I prefer to have most flexible palette knives. You will see later that I am using in other tools when I don't really need the flexibility of palette knife. So with a big brush, just filling the darks in the background, introducing more darks in the hair. It's time to to apply the values, the correct values. Because when I squint, I see that the dark part of the hair is just blending with the background. So we deal with a lost edge there, and I want to achieve it, but without just blending and losing the information, rather with a close value. More expression in the hair. So for me, it's kind of it's like a focus near the focal point around their eyes. Around the eyes, we have more smooth and precise rendering. And while moving outwards of the center, the design of the shapes is getting more abstract and more chaotic, with more expression. It can be achieved with many ways, but it is good to keep in mind that our human's vision is tunnel vision. So normally we have only small area of our visual area to be really in focus. So towards peripheral parts of our visual area, things are getting blurred with less information. More refinement of the shapes on the side of her head. So I constantly revisit the focal point and the skin tones and the face in general. This constant change of focus is very helpful. It keeps your eye fresh without being preoccupied in one area for too long. And back into the hair again. At this moment, I think still I'm thinking about bigger shapes, the larger shapes in that area. Because for me, there is no point to focus on smaller shapes until I nail down the bigger picture. So you see, like, to work from general to specific, it doesn't mean to use the same method all the time. The method, the paint application, the tools can be different. Even the mixtures or approach to building the layers can be different. So here you can see I continue to search for correct relationships between the different value groups, especially near the eyes and eye socket areas, since it is a natural focal point. And I constantly fight with the urge of painting everything green in the shadows, because it is quite green in the reference due to movie post-production. So I tried to invent colors to make them look more natural, but still keeping some initial green versus red complementary color scheme from the reference. More abstract paint application in the hair. I use a lot of medium now to increase flow. So I can just blend things and I can move things around. I don't try to match the shapes as I see them in the hair, because hair can be very different. So I just want to find some nice design first and to bring it to certain logic, which I can see looking at my reference or at my model. The orange light on the hair is not so powerful as I painted, but at this moment I just want to key this light, because since we see the orange light on the cheekbone structure, it should be somewhere in the hair structure as well. And again, cooler shadow on top of the warmer shadow. Don't like it and just fix it back into the warm temperature. Probably it is why painting from movie stills can be longer than from proper reference, because we have to invent so many colors, we have to reconsider so many relationships. But it is still good practice nonetheless, so I highly recommend to work from such references. They force us to be precise with the likeness, to be accurate, and also to reconsider things instead of copying them. A little occlusion just below the wing of the nose. Yeah, and now it's time to introduce some effects of the hair. Before I was using very flexible palette knife, and now I'm using the real knife. I use sometimes the knife to scrape down things, and also for the hair, like here, because nothing can make such a long, sweeping, thin mark as a knife. So I can scrape things with the knife, I can drag the paint with the knife, and I can even try to paint with a knife, like you see right now at this moment. Don't want to overwork the texture in the hair, so I try to work slow, careful. Even despite probably this method looks a little bit reckless, but I try to be in control. I see that tip of the nose requires additional modeling, because actual highlight is again just the meeting of two planes, and plane which is on top of the tip of the nose should be slightly cooler in mixture. Here I try to create really thick highlights. And if I don't like the outcome, I can just blend it with a knife, or I can just make it smoother. On a close-up, you can see that there is still very thin and uniform layer of the shadow, and it is juxtaposed to the thick and texturized layer of the lights. The same with the forehead now. More texture and more physical thickness of the paint. So for this, epoxide oil gel works perfectly. And I really like how it dries later, so it is a very interesting medium to play with. So as you can see, no matter the tools, I try to paint directly, and I constantly keep myself looking at the painting as a whole, as just by stepping back, by squinting a bit, by looking into the small mirror, by looking to the big mirror, by rotating the painting every time I'm not sure about my decisions, so I can just rotate it upside down and continue to paint, or just to look at it and continue to paint in normal orientation. So representation is the most important for me. The illusion of three-dimensional form. But at the same time, I really like to have variety in paint application. In this case, the painting becomes more decorative, interesting by itself. Like small accents with vermilion. Went too bright there, so I have to just to blend it back. If knife does not help, the brush can do the job. And such experimentation with the paint application is going to be unique for every one of you. So it is a really nice exercise for finding your own voice, for finding your visual language, or just a manner of painting. Revisiting the core shadow, because we really need it for proper illusion. And I keep in mind that the core shadow is the darkest and also warmest part of the shadow. The orange to the left is not the shadow, so the shadow is smaller than it was before. So since everything is very wet, you see, I continue to blend and to soften the paint application, the layer. Changing my tools, changing brushes from soft to firm, and from brush to knife, even different types of knives. For the blending, it is better to have the brush clean and try to use not just clean but also dry, so there should be no mineral spirits on such brush, because there is a risk of destroying or diluting the paint, and the outcome can be unpredictable. Normally I just have one or two clean brushes always handy for such work. And the blending also can be done with with a slightly loaded brush. So you will blend, and also you will blend in the mixture you want to introduce, you want to add. So this is pretty much the end of it. It is, for me, it was always difficult to learn where to stop. I've done a lot of mistakes and I've overworked so many good paintings. Now I personally, I prefer to keep part of the painting unfinished when I do such sketches. And if I need to continue to finish, I always can just re-wet the surface by oiling out and add more detalization or just paint something on top. So for the sketches like that, sometimes less is more, especially in the areas which are peripheral. So now you see I'm using another knife. So I have two types of knives. One is longer, one is shorter. And the palette knife again. At this stage, I see that the painting works, everything looks okay, at least for me. And I really like these chaotic shapes in the hair. So the final result looks more dynamic than it was just a couple of hours ago. The whole process of the second layer, it was about 2.5 hours. So the first layer was 3.5, and the second layer was 2.5. So altogether, it's about 6 hours. The same result can be achieved in 6-hour painting day, just three 2-hour sessions with a short breaks. But for working this way, it is better to use oil ground canvas with the oil ground. So the first layer will not dry so fast. If you work on acrylic gesso ground, it can dry too fast, so you will have to wait until it dries completely so you can oil out and continue to work. So the last advice for today is, if you feel like the layer is somehow in between dried and wet and it is not really comfortable to paint on top, it is better to stop and to wait until the layer is totally dry. Do not try to oil out half-dried layer. It can lead to disaster, so be very careful. Better to wait until it's totally dry, or just dry to touch, and it is okay for oiling out. Now I try to build even more paint on the top of her hair. Since it is reflecting more light, I've decided to throw in more pigment. And I try to follow this type of logic. More light, thicker the paint, less light, thinner. The transparency in the shadows is creating illusion of the atmosphere. To finish this sketch, all I need is just to introduce more greens to key this color. It is going to be less saturated and lighter, but still I used this Viridian, which I was using for the lights in the skin and especially for the hair. Now I want to use it as well for the jacket. And this is what we can learn from such references as this one, to key certain colors throughout our composition. This is the end, so thank you so much for watching. Until the next time, happy painting. Bye bye.